Our next speaker is Jason Meyenburg, who's the Chief Commercial Officer from Orchard Therapeutics. I think you know a little bit about their pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the good introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I guess I thought, in preparing for today, I thought maybe that I'd be one of the more disappointing set of slides because I'm coming toward the end and so many intelligent and really brilliant people ahead of me. But now I'm even more disappointing because I don't, in fact, have any slides to address the launch plans for OTL 101 and how we deal with that compared to Strimvelis at Orchard. We are continuing to work with GSK, and we'll be doing this for some time. Happy to take questions probably after the session, maybe a little bit more appropriate, as I'm sure there's other colleagues of mine in the audience as well. Just a forward-looking statement point here. I do work for a company. Things that we say, they're subject to risk and all of the things that can happen in life. I thought today maybe the most appropriate thing for me to do would be to give a little bit of a review of sort of where we've come from. And I think there's been a smattering of that already, obviously, but certainly from an industry perspective when it's coming to gene therapy. And really the term gene therapy, as I'm coming to learn in my short tenure at Orchard so far, it's so well misunderstood, actually. Even talking with friends and family and colleagues, there's more than just gene therapy. There's a lot to it. A lot of that is obviously represented here in Chicago over the last couple of days and the next several days. As the prior speaker highlighted, it's historically been a very, very long path to get these therapeutics, these medicines to people. Certainly there are people who can benefit from them in the clinical trial setting and sometimes via early access programs and compassionate use and so on. There have been some improvements. I think we've seen the evidence of that in a number of announcements with respect to launches over the past several years, not just here in the US, but really robustly in Europe as well. But I think as the last speaker indicated, really what is helping that move along much more dramatically is a faster and faster pace of improvement in the collaboration between academia and industry. And there are great things that academia can do, and there are great things that industry contribute as well. So there's no doubt that we have to continue to push on that topic hard because, as earlier speakers said as well, there's many, many, many more diseases out there that can be addressed and need to be addressed. People who deserve medicines and deserve the opportunity to go from being a patient to hopefully a person in their life. Also, it goes without saying the R&D investments are significant, to say the least. It's probably easy for us to say that as industry, and I would hope that folks don't understand that to mean that we're hiding behind it. It's a reality of a regulated industry that we work in. It doesn't mean that we look to generate expenses. Rather, we try to find faster and faster and more efficient ways, to register these products and develop them. But it is part of our life, as well as the fact that this particular treatment modality, whether it be CAR T, ex vivo autologous, however it is not the cheapest endeavor with respect to manufacturing and the labor behind that manufacturing process. And those manufacturing processes also change and become improved over time as well. These are considerations that don't just stop at the time of approval or at the time of access through national reimbursement in certain countries. I think finally, with respect to commercialization, Eric, I think, really touched upon it quite well. It's one thing for a product to become approved, even reimbursed, however that might happen, whatever pathway that might be from country to country. But it's another thing for us to continue to make sure that people have access to these medicines. And I think, frankly speaking, that's where we come to the big conundrum. Within a company, price, reimbursement, market access, these are topics that we talk about on an hourly basis. And it's throughout the company, whether you come from commercial, medical, clinical development, finance, IT, because we all share this in common. We all are impacted by this and affected by this in our lives. I mean, the entirety of the audience, the city of Chicago, and well beyond, obviously. So it's fair for us all to have an opinion and, frankly, a perspective. But in bringing these medicines to people who need them, right, What we are not doing right now in the area of gene therapy is we're not necessarily finding clarity as quickly as we're also starting to bring therapies to the community, to the medical community, to the patient community. And some of these commercialization burdens lie not just in things like density of payment, you might hear about durability of effect, right? How many implantations would be required or not? We're not just talking about annuities. These are structural topics, policy topics. And it takes some strong leadership for us to address this. It takes also some momentum in the industry, and not just from the industry, but with respect to the U.S. from payers, whether they be private payers or Medicare and Medicaid. So in some sense, there's no silver bullet here that's going to help us. Rather, it's probably going to take a lot of leadership to bring a lot more clarity and simplicity to quite a difficult system here in the U.S. and abroad as well, for that matter. I think last point on this slide would be there are other post-marketing obligations that we have as companies that are not small. The requirements to follow up on patients, for example, who may only have a one-time treatment in their life, and the insistence to try to follow up and determine how are those patients actually doing. It may be in a clinical trial setting something that's quite reasonable. It's a very controlled environment. But I think the more and the better that we do at providing access and opening up the opportunity of these therapies to people, we get to a much larger and broader and more diverse group of people. And their life challenges and life events are very different. And at times, that follow-up becomes quite onerous as well. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's an example of the practicalities. So actually, the European Union, as the last speaker highlighted, has had quite a bit of success actually in the area of ATMPs. There have been 10 products that have been approved. Many of them, if not all really, frankly, have hit the market. Though I think that you see that there's a good percentage of these therapies that are no longer on the market or suspended either briefly or probably for a longer period of time. And I think that that's speaking a little bit to, there's a little lack of clarity as to how to bring these to market. So while we see that the example of the European Union is fantastic, it gives us a line of sight to the fact that there's not just a will, but there's actually a pathway to the means to bring these products to market. But in fact, whether you talk about efficiency, productivity, profitability, quite frankly, it's not always a sustainable practice. And if you look to the geographies, this is really difficult. From an industry perspective, if there are no consistent rules, even within a given country, as to how to bring these products to market and how the systems might be amenable within a given country to make sure that there's access, and there's not a consistency in how we look at assessing value in these products, probably the most important aspect of all of this. We talk about price, we talk about different reimbursement mechanisms, we talk about rebates, all of these different complexities. But the one point that I think that the European Union has gotten really right over the last decade, frankly, right, is that they're seeing, they might not always be able to characterize it explicitly, but they're seeing absolute value in these products. So I think that that just means that there's got to be a little bit of call to arms, frankly, that we do a better job at explicitly, and as I think Wendy also stated, transparently describing that value, transparently describing our price. What does the price mean to us as a company? What does the price mean to a payer, whether that be a government or Medicare, Medicaid, or a private payer like an Aetna or a United Healthcare? That transparency and that explicit work to describe value is probably going to be a point that many people, as far as stakeholders are concerned, as Eric highlighted earlier, can come around. So this is not just an industry, unfortunately, responsibility. We are obviously a key member of this at this table. But we've also got to have some clarity with respect to the other stakeholders so that, frankly speaking, we don't have any patients who are left behind. At Orchard, and as other companies have been highlighted, we're in the business of making sure people with rare diseases get therapies, right? These are already people who are left behind societally. These are already people whose normal and extent of complexity in life is nothing like my personal normal. right? And so the burden can't be to say that we've got complexity to get through. The burden's got to be, how do we find simplicity and get to the marrow of the matter and make sure that we can bring medicines with value, to the last speaker's point, but also make sure that we can clarify what is that value. So we've seen some really fantastic examples in the US in particular, literally even in the last months. And they're therapies that work, they've been approved, patients are starting to get access to them quite robustly, frankly. But I think that in the US, we're probably some of the worst culprits right now of not trying to find simplicity and offer up new suggestions. I dare say sometimes innovation in healthcare structure can be really difficult, and unfortunately it's very time consuming. So maybe there's a long-term look toward how do we change some of that structure, but in the immediate future, we've also got to find and use existing pathways to make sure that these therapies that are coming to the market are actually getting to people, actually treating people. I think finally, and I'll try to be giving back some time to the chairpersons, I think finally, look, this is a compelling promise in gene therapy, whether CAR T or ex vivo or AAV. And it's something that could be perceived as being withheld if we don't provide access. But as has been said before, access has to come with a price. Now, that price must be assessed based on value. And at this point, density, durability, rebates, pay for performance, outcomes-based payments, so on and so forth. There are lots of different words and options, but I think that what we've got to focus on right now is making sure that we define what is value, to define the price, but frankly, if we're defining the value and we can do that well, the reimbursement aspects, the payment aspects will also follow, because if we've met a threshold, if we've met someone's expectations with respect to value, it's likely that they'll also be inclined to accept simpler approaches when it's coming to payment and reimbursement as well. And these, frankly, are the real barriers to access to people getting access to the therapy. So I would say that value is where we're spending a lot of our time in Orchard. How do we describe that? So far, historically, we frankly, right, just as people out there are walking around day to day, we think quickly and we associate value with cost. Cost to the institution, cost to the payer, frankly, cost to the patient as well, or the caregivers, the families, right? These are all parts of value, but we've got to also do a better job describing the other aspects of value. And you know, there's been a lot of experience in the last 20 years, frankly, around quality of life. We're getting better and better at doing this and characterizing it in industry. But there's got to be other value as well that we describe, beyond cost, beyond quality of life. So that's the burden on us. That's the burden, quite frankly, back to the medical community. That's where we look to partner with the medical community and academia, and some of that early work that can be done in this space, in the gene therapy space. For sure, there's more consistency in Europe, and for sure, we need to sort of get out of our own way a little bit in the United States as well, and get toward thinking about people and patients. But at the same time, there's also a persuasive opportunity here. Remember, it's a single shot, and we potentially have the opportunity to turn a patient into a person. That's something that I think since the dawn of time that we've been trying to do. And you know, I had a former colleague who loved Star Trek, and I don't know if you remember, but you know, the physician on the USS Enterprise had this little device and could both detect anything medically wrong with anyone almost instantaneously, but even within an hour could also deal with mortal ailments and injuries and so on. And in fact, we sort of have that opportunity in a large way here as well in front of us. And there's an immense brain trust here in Chicago to not just figure out how to do that, but how to get that to people. And we've got to always come back to what's the value. Do we bring another medicine for the same disease, yes or no? What's the incremental importance of that second therapy, as was highlighted in the last presentation? But if we don't come back to value, we're not going to also continue to remind ourselves that we must bring the therapies to the people who need them. Thanks very much.